Firstly, can I just say thank you all for taking time away from your weekend to be here. As you'll know from your invites, this is a follow-up live event of Advocacy, the podcast, a podcast that Razlan, Michelle, who's not here, I think, and I started during COVID. We are very, very proud of the 3 seasons we have so far produced, and many of you will know that the airwaves have been silent since our last episode with Lady Hale in July of 2023. We needed a break, and we have had one. But thanks to your encouragement, we are happy to say that we are ready for season 4. So recording is going to start in the next month or so, and we hope to be dropping episodes in the new year. In the meantime, we are very fortunate to kick off season 4 by doing this live event, in effect getting some extra time with Toby Landau, who was a guest, a star on our season 3. He has had a remarkable career as a barrister and an arbitrator since he was called in 1993. He studied at Oxford, graduating, of course, with a first, and then got a first in his BCL as well, vomit. He read for an LLM at Harvard, and is currently a sole practitioner in London and a member of Duckon Hill Chambers in Singapore. And we'll speak about that in a few minutes. He has appeared as counsel before, of course, in England and Singapore, and is also a member of the bars of New York and BVI. Toby's had a broad commercial and international practice in London, Singapore, Hong Kong, Caribbean, and unusually, he has appeared in courts in Pakistan. Apart from his work as counsel and arbitrator, Toby is a visiting professor in King's College London, and he was Chambers International Arbitration Silk of the year 2023. He has acted in, obviously, apart from the very heavy commercial matters he does, in investor-state treaty cases as well. So, Toby, that's you introduced to the gang. Now, let me introduce you to the gang. So, what we have here, the guests we have here today, I think are amongst them, there will be some of the top barristers in KL. There are also some of the top solicitors in KL. From big firms, from small, medium-sized firms as well. And there are also some very, very competent, very good senior junior advocates as well. So that's your audience. And if you're good with that, we can kick off with the Q&A. Super. Right, so let's begin by perhaps asking you, firstly, given that it's a Saturday morning and we've got mums and dads in the audience, if your kid wanted to do law, what route would you tell them to take?
So I'm going to begin with an apology, which is I've come together with a chest infection and a very ropey voice, which I'm hoping will have the effect of giving me some unexpected added gravitas. But that may not last long. So you're going to have to bear with me, and I'm told that all the coughs and splutters will be edited later, because there's no edit button. So, yeah, the question was what to tell my child who might want to do law as to which route. And which route you mean?
So would you suggest they go and do law at university? Would you suggest they do a history degree first? What would you do?
So my feeling is that there is no rush to go into law if you want to be a lawyer in terms of studying law. And actually, to be the best lawyer is to be the most rounded person. And to be the most rounded person, as long as you have financially, you have the luxury of time, is to go and do other things first, which is where I really recommend the US system, actually. And you come to law when you know you really want to do law and when you've learned something else other than law. And that's because you build a whole range of skills in studying other things, and those skills will be incredibly valuable to you as a practicing lawyer, as opposed to being a technical lawyer, getting the top marks in law, doing everything you can in law, but that's all in law. And I have another top tip for parents, which is do not make the mistake that I and my wife made with my own child. My wife, who is also a lawyer, and the textbook mistake is to say to your child, study anything you want, anything, but don't study law. Because you know what will happen.
Right, thank you.
Studying law.
Thank you for that, Toby. Right, let's turn now to the role of a specialist advocate, because that's what you are. And you've practiced in jurisdictions with a fused profession and jurisdictions with a split profession. Tell us a little bit about what you think is the better one and why.
So this is an objective, unbiased assessment of the independent bar, of which I have been a member for some years. I am a great fan of the independent bar, having seen up close both systems. I think in truth, both systems have something equivalent actually as a matter of substance. Because in both systems, you will have specialists who gravitate towards advocacy or gravitate towards particular areas of law and are no longer generalists. And they may not be part of a separate profession, but they may be readily identifiable as separate professionals who may well get instructed within a fused profession in any event. So I think it's natural to treat advocacy as a separate specialism. Putting that separate specialism into a separate profession has a number of concrete benefits. And I think there are three of them, actually. The first one is to have the advantage of a professional who is just devoted to advocacy only. Because advocacy is something that you never stop learning. It's something you have to do frequently to keep on your toes. If you don't do it for a while, you feel rusty. And as you do it, and as you listen to others doing it, you hone your skills, you find new ways of doing things, you discover what works, what doesn't work, and that's an ongoing process. And so the privilege of being an independent practitioner as an advocate is that that's all you're doing, day in, day out. And therefore, by definition, if it works, you've got more opportunity to hone your skills than you might do in a big firm, where you've got different calls on your time. I think another advantage is that the independent bar is a resource that law firms and clients can choose. They can pick and choose as they want. And that means you don't just have an in-house advocacy department. You go to the advocate who you want for your particular case. And cases come in all shapes and sizes, and advocates come in all shapes and sizes. And there are horses for courses. So there are some kinds of case where you'll know the kind of advocate you want and the kind of advocate you don't want. And you might want to mix and match with a particular junior. That is the great advantage of the independent bar. And the third, I was tempted to leave it at 2 because my voice is already fading, but I'll chance it. The third one is an independence of view, of perspective on a case. As an independent practitioner, when we get brought into cases, you are instructed by people who have been living and breathing a case very often for some time. Not always, but often. And that can be the law firm, or it can be the in-house counsel department. And what you have as an independent practitioner is the ability to actually bring a completely different view, to see something fresh, and to put yourself in the position of a judge or an arbitrator, and actually take a view of somebody who hasn't been living and breathing it for some time.
And the advantage of that, the third point?
Objectivity. Less likely to be part of groupthink. Ability to say I disagree. Because it's not your client, the end client, in so much as your main client is your instructing counsel, people will feel freer to say something that might not be so readily attractive or readily well received.
Okay. Let me ask you then, in terms of the appointment of a specialist advocate, in your experience, when should that happen, and why do you think that might change the outcome?
All right, can I ask you a technical question first?
Sure.
What impact will there be if I answer all other questions from behind a throat lozenge?
No, that's fine, that's fine, that's fine. We can live with that, we can live with that.
I'm hoping my slurping doesn't get amplified. There are many different ways...
As long as it's not drooling, we're okay.
I can't guarantee, actually, at my age. There are many different times in which you can bring in independent counsel. The optimum, actually, is as early as possible. Not necessarily for them to be there on the scene the whole time, but to be there as a sounding board, as a checking system, in order to know that as you are building a case for litigation or arbitration, you're doing it in the right way. The hardest kind of instruction that we get at the independent bar is when it's all too late. And that's often the hospital pass. That's the nightmare where things have gone wrong and it's too late to change things. And then you're not going to get the most out of your independent counsel.
Toby, just to follow up on what you're saying just now about the ability to give independent advice to clients. I mean, a lot of our listeners are lawyers. Some are of the slightly younger vintage. And quite often, the challenge, particularly for a younger advocate, is how do you actually advise the client who thinks they have a fantastic case, but actually they don't? And how do you do that? The General Counsel of Maybank in front here is just laughing. Could you just give us, I suppose, a taste on how that ought to be done delicately but firmly, so that the advice comes through?
My experience has been that people are, however tough they seem, they are interested and want the truth. So you have to package the truth in a diplomatic way so that they will listen. And that's also a cultural question.
Yeah, because you do work for the Pakistani government, and I think they're not easy clients to advise, right?
Just say no to.
Yeah, on the basis that you're not broadcasting in Pakistan. It's not just Pakistan government, but there are many, many different governments and people and companies who will only listen to what they want to hear. And confirmation bias infects all of us. And if you say something which is contrary to somebody else's view, especially if it's a view which they've invested in, which has cost them money, which other people have been reinforcing, they won't listen, or they'll be less likely, they'll be more hostile. So you have to package it diplomatically, and that's a cultural issue, often. It's also hierarchies. So for many years, I have been told that I look very young. Obviously no longer, but that's a handicap in some parts of the world. Because people will say, well, who are you to tell me that my view is wrong? You look so young. And there'll be people in the room, tantalizingly, who know the answer, but because they feel they're in their presence of seniors, they won't speak up. So, excuse me, this is getting more and more gravelly.
Sounding like Joe Cocker now.
I feel like breaking into song, actually, but I'm going to do a couple of numbers now. But in the end, what matters is your reputation and speaking the truth. And that truth can be packaged in a number of ways. And as I say, my experience is people are grateful in the end if you can justify it. And you can actually say, with all respect, if I were coming at this fresh, as the judge will come at it fresh, or the arbitrator, here is what I will see. And if that's well-reasoned, even if it's unattractive, that will be appreciated.
I'd like to ask you now, this is something we spoke about sort of offline, about the trend in London now in terms of big companies, general counsel appointing big solicitors firms. Is it still the traditional model, or has it changed?
It is changing. So there is autopilot, which is big firm has general counsel, nobody in this room, by the way. Big firm has general counsel, claim comes in, general counsel, autopilot, hives it off to standard number of firms. Either they're on a panel or they're firms that they know. There'll be some exercise in pitching sometimes. You'll have pitches, but all of that traditionally has been quite limited in terms of fitting a mold of a big law firm. What we're seeing now increasingly is more creativity in the structuring of litigation teams. And that structuring can be not just one big firm and its operation. It can be using the independent bar in different ways, either with a big firm or without a firm, or with a very, very small firm. And that's by putting together a number of individual practitioners as your team at different levels of seniority, from top to bottom, fleshing out middle along the way, and building a team that would be the equivalent of a team within a law firm. But what you're doing is you're making it bespoke. You're hand-picking people at different levels. And that reduces, again, no law firm represented in this room, but it reduces redundancy. Sometimes when you instruct a big law firm, you are paying for, you're building in a lot of people who you'll never know what they do, or why they do it, who they are. You'll know the big names at the top. Then you'll have a long list of names, but you won't necessarily have total visibility of what everybody is doing, but you'll be paying for it. So a new way of doing this is to actually pay more attention to each of the individuals in your team and build something together. Now, it's not easy, because if you have a collection of independent practitioners, you need management. You need somebody in the team who will know what they are doing, how they're interrelating, making sure that they don't overlap too much. But we're seeing that increasingly as a model. Yeah.
Interesting. I'd like to turn now to something that's going to be of interest to the practicing lawyers in the room. Can you tell us your observations about the sort of latest trends in written and oral advocacy?
This is quite difficult to generalize because we're kind of speaking globally, I suppose. But if one were to pick out a general trend, I think both in arbitration and in litigation, there is a reaction to excesses that we have seen over many years. So it's a common criticism that arbitration, for example, is too expensive, too cumbersome, too costly, too inflexible. Similar criticisms of litigation, huge litigation costs. Thank you very much, thank you. Huge litigation costs, huge amount of time, and a frustration on the part of courts and judges, equivalent to the frustration on the part of arbitrators. So the current trends are really reacting against that. And that is an increase in case management. That is, judges and arbitrators getting hold of disputes proactively and trying to case manage in a way to avoid lawyers' excesses, written excesses and oral excesses. And that features, or it manifests in a number of concrete areas. Increasing controls on what written pleadings and memorials look like, their length, their content, their tone, how much they will assist, how much they don't assist. Witness statements, massive changes in the approaches to witness statements, witness evidence, both in litigation and in arbitration. Curiously, the one development is actually led now by the courts, even more than arbitration, with what you may know here as our very new practice, well, relatively new now, practice direction, the Commercial Court in London, which is changing the whole approach to the production of witness statements, thankfully.
What is that?
Right, so this is 57 AC, practice direction, CPR. If none of you have got anything better to do in your lives, you could pick that up, and especially Saturday night, can't think of anything better. Read it through. It actually is fascinating. It draws upon current, well, actually it's not current, it's well-established scientific evidence as to how human memory works. And it draws upon everything that lawyers do with witness statements that they shouldn't. So very, very quickly, and I'm making this even shorter because I may not be able to speak soon. Witness statements, none of you will probably recall this. Witness statements, you won't believe it, used to be the evidence of witnesses. I know. I know, but trust me. Trust me on this one. And obviously it's not, and it hasn't been for some time, obviously it is a written submission. Obviously it's in the same font as the pleadings, with the same law firm reference in the bottom left-hand corner. Obviously, even though when the witness testifies and can't even string a sentence together, the witness in the witness statement has used the word aforementioned. So this, all the excesses of witness evidence, and it drives judges mad, and it drives arbitrators mad, because they've got to sift through all this nonsense. And it raises the ante as well, because if you're going to have this 200-page witness statement drafted by lawyers with perfect grammar, then you need days of cross-examination to unpack it. So you're just escalating all the costs. And then we go through all this ridiculous pantomime in hearings where a witness comes along thoroughly cooked, completely prepared, witness statement drafted by the lawyers, with a script, essentially. And then they're cross-examined, we get to re-examination, and still we play this game where someone says, you can't ask that, that's a leading question. Yeah. I mean, come on, at that point, the ship has sailed. This is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. So, what CPR 57AC has done is to bring this back to the evidence of witnesses with costs consequences if you don't follow it. This is at the moment only for trial witness statements, not for affidavits and interlocutory stuff. So, if you look at it, it's a whole best practice, but also rules as to what goes in a witness statement and what doesn't. Witness statements now, under that practice direction, cannot contain any narrative or prose that is not the actual evidence of the witness. Can't recite other documents. Can't refer and quote other evidence. It's got to have in it a narrative as to how the witness's recollections were put together. What documents were shown the witness, when, by whom. It's so that judges can test the reliability of the recollection. This is a whole other lecture none of you will ever want to attend. I love to give whenever I can.
I'll come.
About human memory. All right, so this is a whole other topic, but if I could just very, very shortly say, you may know human memory is not what lawyers think it is, and it's not what the legal system is built on as assuming, all right? We assume as lawyers that human memory is like a recording device with start, stop, and playback buttons. And it is not. It's not. So when you say, can I just refresh your memory? You have no idea what you're saying, with respect. Memory is a construction process. I'm stopping in a minute. Memory works very, very quickly like this, right? I'm going to encapsulate a mass of scientific evidence in a few sentences. You perceive something, it goes, which of course is subjective, it goes into your head. Believe it or not, when it goes into your head, that memory, if it's a single memory, gets separated into hundreds of different subgroups. Smell will be treated differently from color. Animals will be treated differently from other physical objects. Each of those memories gets put in a different bit of your brain physically. Imagine that. It's then stored, it degrades over time. In the meantime, other things go into your head and get stored. When you're asked to recollect a memory, you go through a process of reconstruction. You're not just going to one little cabinet and taking out memory. You're going around your brain and reconstituting. Every time you do that, other corruptions come in. Other information that you didn't actually perceive, but's in there. Like a lawyer telling you what happened. Like a document you were shown. Like a leading question you were asked in an interview. When you recollect it, you are honest. This is the critical point. It's not dishonesty. You honestly recollect it, except that what you're recollecting isn't a true recollection. Or it's partly true, or it's corrupted. I'll stop. So, the modern approach now, which hopefully we will see in courts around the world, including here, is to bring back the process of proofing a witness and adducing witness evidence so it's closer to the science. So that the judge can say, well, how did you come to that recollection? Who asked you the questions? When? Bear in mind also that every time you recollect something, the more times you recollect it, your recollection gets stronger. Because you're doing this reconstruction process. Right, that's it.
Could I just ask then, just to follow up, if that's the case, why don't we just go back to the old way of doing it? Yeah. Oral examination in chief. Like Gopal and I started with doing trials. We started doing that. None of this witness statement rubbish, right?
So a lot of people do say that, but the problem is, I don't know how many people in the room will remember it, but examination in chief is really inefficient, and it has problems. So one of the problems is it takes a long time. Actually, for counsel, it's brilliant because it's your opportunity to read into the case if you haven't read before the hearing starts.
Yeah, that's true.
But because sometimes it would take weeks. But anyway, but the problem is it doesn't allow witnesses to provide the most coherent presentation of their evidence. That was one of the major criticisms at the time. Sometimes it comes out incoherent. They're not helped in the way that they present their evidence. The other major problem is it causes ambushes for the other side. So it's not a perfect answer.
Yeah, I think incoherence we see in witness statements as well, yeah, not just from witnesses. Toby, let me now turn to your experience in these multiple jurisdictions. How important is local knowledge for you, that is to say, knowing the judge, and conversely, how important is it for the judge to know you?
So, both are critical. And I have really experienced this in arguing before different courts around the world, as well as before different arbitral tribunals. That knowledge of who you are arguing in front of, and equally sitting as arbitrator, who you are listening to, is critical. And to me, the reason for that is that as advocates, we often make a mistake. And the mistake, is that brandy? Oh, no, sorry. Good, thank you. The mistake we make as advocates is to treat advocacy as a technical subject which has rules of things that you do and things you don't do. And that's partly how advocacy is taught, partly because of the limitations of teaching skills. So we go into it thinking, right, I've got to be concise, I've got to be clear, I've got to have a good order of things. And people in advocacy lectures will say, here are 10 things to do to be a good advocate. Right? This is all not rubbish, but they're more important things which are missed. And here's what's missed. In order to persuade anybody, which is your job as an advocate, you have to form a personal link. It's no different from any social situation. It's about psychology. Yes, there's technical law. Yes, there are basic ways of speaking to be clear. But much more than that, you've got to get under the skin of the person you are speaking to in order to find out which buttons to press, how to present something, how to package something in order to persuade them. It's no different from persuading a friend to do something. You'll know how to craft something. In a situation of litigation and arbitration, it's curious. You can spend a long period of time in a closed room with a number of strangers who you will get to know very well for this period of the hearing. And as an advocate, you've got to get to know them intimately so that you know how to present something. You can present something beautifully and clearly and well structured, but miss somebody because you haven't realized that they're not going to understand it that way, or the cultural reference won't be quite right. So to me, the essence of good advocacy is actually psychology, it's interpersonal skills and it's emotional intelligence. And that means you've got to know the person. Now, we don't know, even in a jurisdiction that you're growing up in and you're just practicing in one jurisdiction, you won't know everybody. In international arbitration, it's a nightmare because there may be arbitrators you never come across before. In my case, qualifying in different jurisdictions means not having local knowledge. All of those are disadvantages, and all of them, for me, creates a focus to work on, so that I need to know everything about the person that I'm going to argue in front of. And then you find out local things, you find out information that you need, curious things, even personal likes and dislikes. I'll give you one example, very quickly, without naming any names. Lady Hale. Lady Hale, you may not know, when she was sitting in the Supreme, sorry? Yeah, all right, that's very nice, excellent, Lady Hale. Great. Lady Hale designed, it was her design in the layout of the new Supreme Court in London to have special shelves behind counsel where their files go, so that the files are not put in front of them on the desk and get in the way of the sight line between the bench and counsel, because the bench in the new UK Supreme Court is low level. right? Now, that is important local information. Because if you were to argue when she was sitting in front of Lady Hale, and you didn't use her shelf at the back, and you put your files, she would be irritated, and she was irritated. Now, she won't express it. She's a very sophisticated, very nice person. But you cannot persuade somebody in the same way if they're thinking, it's a good argument, but why are your files there?
So do you actually take time out? So let's assume you're appearing before Mr. X in the Singapore High Court. You take time out to go and get that local knowledge?
Absolutely. I ask around,
Yeah.
and I try and ramp up. And then, of course, the minute you start speaking, you've got to have your radar finely tuned for any reaction. You start speaking, again, advocates make this mistake because they get into autopilot. You start speaking. Now, if your arbitrator is starting to frown, starting to look around, you can sense they're not really finding the references so quickly. Maybe they've glazed over. Well, that would describe a large proportion of them. But then you've got to change. You've got to do something. You can't carry on like that. It's the same thing. So yes, I spend time on that.
Okay. I want to turn now to the topic of the kite mark. Now, you are Toby Landau KC. In Singapore, we have Davinder Singh SC and Francis Xavier SC. Those are all kite marks at the end of the name. Malaysia has had a tradition of never having that. Do you think it is a valuable device?
So, I gather already that I'm in choppy water on this, whatever I say.
Yes, you are.
I think in the old days of this kite mark, when it was first thought of, it had great value. And the idea was to signal to the public at large that somebody is a specialized advocate of a certain seniority and therefore a certain skill set, supposedly. I think the process has, in most countries, has degraded. And there are problems, real problems with it, such that I cannot now say that everybody with that kite mark, I would say, is a good advocate. And that means it's not working. And on the contrary, it can be misleading. Because if the public don't have that information and they're trusting the kite mark, then that is unreliable information. And not naming names, although I am so tempted. In some instances, it's unfair. They pay a lot of money for the kite mark, and what they're getting is not worth it. So the process of giving the kite mark is difficult to maintain. So that's one major problem. Having a process that's good enough to actually award a kite mark that's always deserved. And then the second problem is this. I think notionally it's difficult to award a kite mark permanently. If somebody is an advocate, are they always going to be a great advocate? I mean, how can that be? Advocacy is exhausting. And you go through cycles, and you can be a great advocate in the past and then no longer such a great advocate, but you've still got the kite mark. So I think that it doesn't bear relation to the reality. There's a cycle of being an advocate. You're young, and you're on this curve of being hungry and striving to be a great advocate. And then you feel you're recognized, and you get to a plateau, and then you become perhaps complacent. And then you relax, and maybe you're no longer as sharp as you were, and it drops off. Actually, a better system, if it were ever possible, would be to do like Singapore does in some substantive areas, which is an accreditation for a period of time, which you then get reaccredited. That would perhaps be more reliable.
So in many ways, I guess what you're saying is that even with the kite mark, the market finds who they want to find, right? Yeah, okay,
Exactly,
all right,
exactly.
all right.
But the problem is not everybody has that market knowledge, but that's the market. So as is often said, you can take silk, but to be marketed as a true silk, you've still got to become a silk, and you've got to spend time developing that. And that's a market issue.
Yeah, okay. Now I want to hop on something you said in your in the podcast in our previous interview, and this is in relation to your journey in drafting the Arbitration Act in 1996 and under Lord Savile. And you referred to yourself at that time as young, cheap, and available. No longer, I'm sure.
I still do. I still do.
Right. Actually, David said he was the one who labeled you young, cheap, and available. But let me ask you, and we've got advocates in this room and solicitors in this room who are in that bracket or want to be in that bracket. When you are there, how do you get work?
Sorry, they want to be young, cheap, and available.
They are, not
All
they
right.
want to
Okay.
be. They are, yeah. How do you get work?
So I'm not sure there's a magic answer to how you get work, but you've got to plant yourself. Well, I think you've got to do two things when you're at the beginning. You've got to firstly hone your skills. So you've got to become a good advocate. You can only become a good advocate by doing it. Right? That's so how do you resolve that? And you resolve that by taking any opportunity to get on your feet. Absolutely any opportunity, without being sniffy about the kind of case, about not being particular about how much you're going to get paid, if at all, when, but just get on your feet. Because, as I say, it's always a learning process throughout your entire career. So you've got to cut your teeth. And at Essex Court Chambers, where I started, where David was senior clerk, there was always a system of pushing juniors out into different kinds of work, whatever it was, for them just to get on their feet, whether it was criminal work, even though it was a commercial set, or small-time maritime arbitrations, or pro bono work. And pro bono is a great way of actually, of just getting on your feet. So that I really recommend. That's the first of two things. And the second thing is you've got to plant yourself on other people's radar. Those are the two issues. Now, planting yourself on the radar, there are different ways of doing it. And now, I think, contrary to when I started, which was in the last century, now there are more opportunities to plant yourself on radar because of social media and because of all the groups of young advocates in different subject areas that exist. You can join up and you can be part of online webinars and conferences and start to present and start to make yourself known. And I think it's just those two things. Without being choosy, you just do whatever comes your way.
Now, I want to ask you about Duxton Hill Chambers in Singapore. You've been a member there for a while. Tell us a little bit about the history and the thinking behind setting up those chambers and what it actually does.
So Duxton Hill is the first and as yet only London barristers' chambers model in Singapore. In terms of regulatory framework, it's a group legal practice, which I understand you also have here and which you're part of. Yes. So group legal practice means it's a number of independent Singapore legal practices that practice together in one establishment with confidentiality restrictions between them. The thinking was to try and find a home for people who want to just specialize in advocacy and to bring the advantages of a specialized bar, which we spoke about at the beginning, to Singapore, even in the context of a fused profession. And it felt at the time as being not impossible to do that because, again, as I mentioned earlier, although Singapore is a fused profession, there are standout advocates in firms who get instructed by other firms, like Francis St. Davy and the small number of very active senior counsel in Singapore. They will act for other firms as counsel. So that was the thinking. And it would be a platform for those of us who practice as advocates, but also for the younger generation to be mentored and to try and find a place where they would naturally be doing more advocacy than anything else, more opportunities. That was the idea. It was highly experimental. It is still somewhat experimental because what it involves is re-educating the Singapore legal market because nobody knows what... We're imposing this experiment on the market, which is happily running without it. So we have to tell people the whole time, and it's been a bit of a burden to do it. Actually, this is what we do, and this is how you can use us. And that's been a slow process. And I think it's been very positive. I think it's been very successful. We're not there yet in terms of everybody understanding exactly what we do. But that was the thinking.
And it's getting there.
I think it's getting. I mean, we've doubled sized.
Yeah.
Recently we've doubled our physical premises.
Right.
We have interestingly, this is I think a really interesting point. We have now, increasingly, steady stream of very young practitioners who want to join, because there's disaffection with law firms And that you can see anyway, because big law firms are often seeing people leave and set up boutiques. All the small boutiques are law firms, but there are people who really want to be on their feet, and they feel even a boutique may not be as good, and they want to come to us. So I think that's very interesting, that the youngsters are interested.
Right.
Sorry,
Ruslan.
just to follow up, could you just give us some examples? What are the challenges in educating the market pertaining to Duxton Hill?
I think what we're seeing at the moment is people at the top of chambers will get work because they have a reputation. Where the difficulty is below that, people who are building a reputation, younger practitioners in the middle. Juniors are attractive because they can be farmed out quite easily, even to law firms. Their hourly rates are very low compared to law firms, and it's very easy for seniors to bring them on as juniors. Yeah. So the difficulty is really the middle sector, where not every case will be big enough to warrant a middle-level practitioner as well as a senior. That middle-level practitioner's got to find work, and the market's got to know that that's a possibility, to use a small firm and a specialized middle-level advocate. And that is about re-educating people in terms of what's available.
Okay. Now I want to turn to solicitors that you work with and general counsel that you work with. What do the best solicitors bring to the table for you, and what do the best general counsel bring to the table for you?
So I think it's difficult to give a short answer that will encapsulate lots.
Take your time.
Let me start with general counsel. General counsel, and I'd add to that government legal department and attorney general, is really the resource who can make your life easier rather than harder. And that is something, it's a fine line between those two. Making your life easier is actually to be able to provide you with all the materials, with all the resources from the client that's needed on time, not late, so that you have the luxury of flexible decision-making without there being a crisis or without there being hurdles in your way. Especially in a government context, but in major companies as well, there's a proportion of counsel's time which is spent not fighting the opponent, but fighting your client. Of course, the fighting is not phrased as fighting, but it is effort to get information, effort to get documents, effort for the client not to make things worse, effort to get support, even support for different kinds of arguments. So that can be summarized by saying really being part of the team, and being part of the team in good time. That's the perfect general counsel. I think that similar things can be said for solicitors. The relationship between independent counsel and solicitor's firm is pretty similar. What you need from a good solicitor instructing you is coherence within the team and not making your life as advocate more difficult. It may sound obvious, but in many cases, actually, you're not getting the help that you need. There's separation, there's dislocation. There's also a phenomenon I just quickly describe. In my voice, I just rest it for a second. Yep. Right, this is actually answering a slightly different question, which is what might have been your next question, which is what's wrong? What do people do that doesn't help? There's a phenomena which I have experienced frequently, and that is, you turn up, let's say, to an arbitration hearing. It can be a big case, and you sit down, and normally it's a U-shaped configuration. So you've got your side, you're looking at the other side, and then you've got your tribunal. And as lead counsel, normally you're at one end. And you've got your notes in front of you, and you're about to start the case, perhaps your opening submissions. And everything that's important about the case is going to be in your notes or your head, and will be communicated by you to the tribunal. If you take a moment to look to your right, down your side of the room, the experience I have very often is I will see a multitude of people, and I don't know who they are. They're part of my team. and they come from the law firm. And apparently, they've been working on this case. And I assume they've been writing lots of memos and doing research. Unless it's in my notes or my head, it's not going to matter. It's going to be a waste of money. So this experience of not knowing what the firm's done and why they've done it and why somebody's paid for it is very real. And that's where the team has not come together properly, not properly coherent as a streamlined battle force.
Toby, if I can follow up on that, when you talk about this kind of incoherence or dissonance between lead counsel and the team that's supposed to support lead counsel, I suppose then what you're talking about is actually the absence of leadership then, right? So in those sort of situations, how do you, as counsel, establish the proper chain of command, directions, etc., etc., so all that what you're talking about doesn't happen?
Yeah. That is the key to it. It's not also it's not just an absence of leadership. Sometimes it's too much leadership, but from different places. So people are reporting to partner, and then they're consulting with counsel. So the way through this is to really integrate the teams. There's an advantage, as we started, in an independent bar with objectivity, but you mustn't misunderstand that as being a separate team. On a case-by-case basis, it's got to be completely integrated once you've got your barrister team. And that is really the burden, perhaps, of lead counsel, to make sure that you invest in very regular, hands-on man-woman management of the team, so that you know and they know what everybody is doing at a particular point and why.
So you would set, I suppose, clear objectives and guidelines and who's supposed to do what, etc. Et
Absolutely. And for the English bar, this is not their sort of regular nature. The English bar may be very different around the world. The English bar comes from a tradition of being treated like an oracle in an ivory tower, where instructions in pink ribbon are served up to you, and you sit there and you opine from on high, and then everybody else does all the implementation. And that is just a different age. It's gone. Can't do that anymore. We used to have rules at the English bar that you could have conferences, but not at a solicitor's firm, because that would count as soliciting for work. Of course, now you've got to get out there and be part of the team.
You've worked in Malaysia with Malaysian lawyers. Tell us a little bit about your experience of Malaysian solicitors. How do we stack up against, and lawyers, how do we stack up against the rest of the world?
Right, so this is now the career shortening section of the event. I'm being honest by saying I can't really say that there is a Malaysian way of doing things. There's nothing in my head which says that things are different in Malaysia. But I think that Malaysia has the same spread as in other countries, if I could put it that way. That's the most diplomatic answer.
It is diplomatic, very diplomatic.
Yeah. So there's good and there's bad, like there's good and there's bad everywhere. I think generally the standard here, if I may say honestly, is actually, at least the standard that I have come across, is very high. And I say that compared to many other jurisdictions around the world, where sometimes I have seen a standard that's devastatingly low.
Okay, thank you. Raz, did you have something to follow up on that? No?
Not on that specifically, but I think I missed my boat. I wanted to ask about the AI question.
Yeah, we'll come to that in just a sec. Actually, why don't you ask that now, Raz, and then we can just tie up with just two areas I wanted to.
Yeah, because Toby and I were talking about before we came on, and I was telling him about the Michael Lewis interview which I heard, the famous author, and he was telling the interviewer his experience as a trader at Solomon in the city of London way back in the 90s. And he said the current traders, Wall Street guys, City of London types, is completely different from the previous century. It's all gone. Those coke addict, coke sniffing, sex addict
More's
type
the pity.
of, masters of the universe type. It's all gone now. It's all guys, muscleless, hairless guys interacting with machines rather, and that's because that's the way it's gone. Quants and AI, etc. Do you think the legal profession could end up that way eventually?
I think it could. I think it could. I mean, people say the same about doctors, actually. In the old days, you go and see your GP, and they would come away from their desk, and they'd come over to you, and they'd put their hands on you and examine, and there'd be some interaction. And certainly in England, very often the experience is you go to your GP, and the GP is looking at the screen and asks you questions, doesn't go near you, and then prints out a prescription. So it's this similar thing, I think, where demands have changed, methods have changed. Now, in law, everything that I have been talking about, in a sense, today is very much about the human psychology element of it, and the interpersonal skills and emotional intelligence. So all that militates against this idea, but like it or not, we are facing something different.
Yeah.
And I think, we will all say, no, it won't happen. But I think it probably will happen. I mean, it's like we are very invested in the way that we do things and the way we want to do it and what we think is good. But we have to step out. This is what Richard Susskind, who you'll all know probably, always says, and he specializes in, the impact of technology on the legal profession. He always focuses on, it's not what we want, it's what the users want. And do the users want in the future to invest in all the processes that we're interested in, or do they want a result? And that's his famous power drill example, which he always speaks about. I don't know if you know the power drill example, the Black & Decker example.
Go on, yeah.
It's very short, but it's very interesting. He says that when Black & Decker power drills, apparently when people join that company, they go for an initial induction lecture, and the management asks them, why do people buy Black & Decker power drills? And most people will say because they like a really state-of-the-art piece of equipment, it looks good, and it's efficient, and they want a drill that they can be proud of and walk around. And the answer is, it's none of that. People want Black & Decker drills because they want holes. That's what they want. They don't want a drill, they want a hole. And it's similar to what we do. People want determination of their case. Do they want a great advocate who's going to be dominating a courtroom and praised afterwards? Actually, they want a result, which is cost-effective, which is efficient, and which passes some kind of threshold of fairness and acceptability, legitimacy. So maybe that means in the future, if AI can deliver that, or part of that, then our job will change.
So, last two areas before we open it up to questions, and I think this is something I wanted to know, and I think I'm sure, looking around the room, I've worked with so many people here, and I know how hard they work and how long they work. How do you manage to take time off? What's the key to staying fresh and energized and wanting to get into court?
Right, so there's a presumption to your question.
Well, I thought all silks take the whole of August off, so...
Yeah. Which you have not got from my family.
Yeah.
I'm answering this with my senior clerk looking at me. So, I mean, work-life balance, as in every field, is completely fundamental to survival and being a good professional. And it's impossible in this job to do this all the time. And I actually think as you get older, it gets much harder. Doesn't get easier. And it's like, our life as an advocate is like permanently being in the state of approaching an examination, or an oral examination. So taking time off in order to be fresh is really, really critical. I have not been brilliantly successful over the years in doing that. But having an understanding person managing my diary has definitely helped. Having having a wife who has his telephone number has helped. But also forward planning, actually, and which as an independent advocate is something different perhaps to law firms, but planning ahead, because the mistake one often makes is you'll say, look, I've got a difficult period now, and after that I'll take time off. And you keep saying that, and of course when you get to that period, your diary's already full. Yeah. And so it's got to be rigid, it's got to be actually...
Inflexible
and really far in advance.
So just to spin off from that, in terms of when you are, and this I think is going to be a common experience for many of us in the room, when we're sitting down preparing for a case and your mobile phone's buzzing with some other client, with a third client, a fourth client, do you use a bunkering system? And if you do, how does one actually set it up?
Right, so this is where my senior clerk, David Grief, will explain. But I go into what he calls the cave. And the cave is a period in the run-up to a hearing where I am firstly not in touch with anybody.
The wife?
I was going to add to that. All right. So not in touch, which means that I might be secretly reading emails, but I'm not responding to them. And and by the way, just a quick footnote. Can I drop to that? I can highly recommend this. And this most people will react against, and I think in Singapore it may be illegal. And that is, if you regularly don't answer your emails, it's incredibly helpful. Because what you do is you reduce people's expectations. And you get known as hopeless person, hopeless correspondent, which is the best thing to be known for, honestly. Because then it just obviously reduces the pressure. So going back to it, I go in the cave, and the cave means I'm just not responding. The other thing is I'm impossible to live with. So even if I'm willing to speak to my wife, she won't want to speak to me. And it's a period of time of complete focus. And in a sense, you have to build your diary, if it works for you to do that. You build your diary around that. So you have an apologist, in my case it's David Grief, who will tell people, I can't contact Mr. Landau because he's in preparing. And that's, you can tell me, is this right? Yeah. and he's the filter. And it's the only way that I can do it. So that when I get into a hearing, I am in a demented state. It's a state of lack of sleep, high pressure, high octane, but really sharp, which is why it's so completely exhausting afterwards, because when the adrenaline, it starts to sweep away, then you're dead after that. But it's a bizarre job in that way, I think.
Yeah,
It's difficult to do it halfway.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, as Dan Carter, the famous New Zealand fly half says, pressure is a privilege, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. The last question, and I'm going to use the language of Lady Hale from her interview and how she described Sydney Kentridge.
Yeah.
Who is the most beguiling advocate you've heard?
It's a shame you introduced it that way, because if you hadn't said that, I would have said Sydney Kentridge. Maybe it is still Sydney Kentridge. I had the privilege of being Sydney Kentridge's junior in a number of cases.
Wow.
And he was unbelievable as an advocate.
So tell us why.
Just incredible. And you may know other big names from London, like Gordon Pollock, Jonathan Sumption. I was Sydney's junior in a number of cases where he came up against them. He was incredible. So for those of you who don't know, Sydney Kentridge was Nelson Mandela's lawyer in South Africa, as well as the lawyer for Steve Biko and some of the great ANC people in South Africa. He argued the toughest cases at the toughest times. And then he moved to London and became one of the greatest advocates at the bar, actually the commercial bar in London, although he did many different things. He was an old school advocate. He had no interest in things like skeleton arguments, which were kind of modern day things. So my job often was to draft a skeleton argument, because you have to do that for the court rules. And I'd go to Brick Court and sit with Sydney. Sydney had no interest in the skeleton argument, and what I hadn't realized early on is he had no intention of following it. But he was very nice. So we'd sit there, and he'd go through the skeleton argument, and he had this way of sort of looking as if he was really thinking. He'd scrunch his eyes, and he'd be thinking, and he'd say, I think you need a comma here. And then the skeleton argument gets submitted. You think, well, that wasn't that bad. He likes my skeleton, didn't have anything to say about it. There's no reference to it whatsoever. And the argument for him was something he crafted in his head as a coherent whole. Right, so when lower beings like us stand up and make an argument, the common thing to do is to structure it in a particular way. So you might structure it by saying, here's an introduction, and then maybe here's a chronology, and here's the law. You do that. Or here's one bit here, and that leads on to this bit here. Now, that wasn't Sydney's style. Sydney would stand up, often with no notes, and he would do an initial sweep across the entire case. The entire case. He'd say this case, and then he'd sweep across it at a high level. Instantly, you've got the entire picture of the case. Then he'd do another sweep with more detail. Keep sweeping like this across the case. Everything is coming together into an irresistible, compelling whole. That was his style. And for the judge, there was known to be a particular facial expression which was a result of Kentridge. And it was a look of panic. Because the judge knew that there would be seams in the argument, but he had to find them. It wasn't so simple to say, well, that argument is wrong, because it all seemed to be working together in a patchwork. It was an incredible skill. Just one other thing. I said no notes, but Sydney believed in old-style courtroom craft. So he was a real actor. Before walking over from Brick Court to the High Court, or whatever court it was, he would often do something like take his counsel's notebook, and he'd rip off a corner of a page, and he'd hold it. Ridiculous, actually. And then he'd walk across in this way he had of sort of looking at some higher level, thinking about things conceptually. And he'd walk into court, and he's holding this little scrap of corner of paper, like this. He walks in as if those are his notes. People didn't realize me, a little way back here, put down the books and everything, but he's just there, and he puts it down. And he dominated the courtroom.
Yes, I heard the closing of his spectacles case was, Tell us about that.
What he did was, I think also this goes back to one of your other questions. One of your earlier questions was, how important is it for the judge or the arbitrators to know counsel as opposed to the other way around? So Sydney developed a reputation such that the judge, everybody knew him. But what they knew him for was for being the expression of morality. He was the person who would tell you what's right and what's wrong. And his manner was about that. And that's why, again, going back to a previous point we discussed, I said that one of the advantages of an independent bar is horses for courses. You choose your advocate given the particular needs of your case. In the old days, it was said at the bar in London, if you had a fraud case and you had a weak argument and you needed a clever technical argument, Jonathan Sumption. Jonathan Sumption was known for being England's cleverest man. And he's brilliant. And he'd come up with a brilliant technical argument. But the judge would know that. It's a clever, brilliant technical argument. If you had a strong fraud case, but you just wanted to express that you're right, you go to Sydney Kentridge. Kentridge would walk in, and he would say to the court, my client is right. And he's been treated badly. Sydney did it in such a way, with such drama. He spoke very slowly, very clearly, that often you would lose track of the fact that he's not cited any authority.
Brilliant. Yeah, and can I just say, you can still see Sydney Kentridge's Advocacy on YouTube. I really would advise every single one of you to go and have a look at it. As Toby says, his pacing is just remarkable. Anyway, that's brought us to the end of what I and Ruslan have to ask you. Can I open it up to the floor for any questions you guys may have?
Hello, testing. Hi, Toby. One question for you. When you were a young, cheap and available lawyer back in the 90s, and in building this character arc of yours to Toby Landau KC, were there moments of doubt? And if so, how did you get out of it? Or how did you handle that?
Right, so that's an easy one, actually. It's not right to say that there were moments of doubt. There remain moments of doubt.
Of self-doubt, sorry.
Self-doubt, completely. There are always still major moments.
Imposter syndrome, right? Yeah.
Completely. Whatever is on the surface, I actually think it's a sign of a good advocate to have those doubts. Actually, I have to go back to Sydney Kentridge and tell you one thing he told me that I always remember, and it was astonishing. I was his junior in one case where he would have been, I think at the time, I don't know, probably in his 80s. And we were arguing a case that was not particularly significant, not particularly interesting. There wasn't anything particularly special about it. And I remember walking with Sydney Kentridge, this great man, with an unbelievable history, both in South Africa and then in London, approaching the court. And he said to me, as we entered the courtroom, he turned to me and he said, obviously for nobody else to hear, he said, "Do you know, even now, every time that I'm about to stand up and speak, I feel like I could vomit." That was what he said. It was incredible. Of course, he never showed it, but there was a burning anxiety. And that's a doubt that, I think if you lose that doubt, in a sense, and lose this, can I do it, or lose imposter syndrome, then you become complacent. And you've got to be in that pre-exam state of mind, actually.
Anyone else? Anyone? No? Yeah, Louis.
Hi, Toby. Louis here. Razlan asked something about AI and its involvement in the profession, and if I may ask, how much of it is relevant to you, or how much of it do you use it actually today?
So personally, I've only got to the stage of playing with it, but I've seen. I mean, I've done cases recently where my juniors have shown me what it could do on a particular case, and it's astonishing, really astonishing. And this is not even the more specialized parts of it, like Harvey and various other things you pay for. Even just ChatGPT, you can already see an unbelievable potential. So I give you some examples. And this was just a couple of months ago. It was an arbitration. And I have to premise this, that there are some difficulties with this, because of course there are confidentiality issues at the moment, which I think my juniors may have massively breached in experimenting, but anyway. What they were doing was putting in some of the documents, for example, an expert report, putting it into a ChatGPT and saying summarize, right? Now that's straightforward. And you will get in an instant a beautiful summary with headings and subheadings, and it's all formatted already. That's easy. Next step, put in 2 expert reports, competing expert reports, and ask for a summary of each. You get that? Then ask, what are the differences between them? You then get a beautiful document in the space of seconds showing how the experts differ. Next step, quantify, assess those differences by reference to the factual record. Now, you're starting to tread seriously into what we do at that point. Of course, there's a whole level of how you package it, strategy, EQ, everything else. But already you can see, I mean, and then of course, they'll come to a point in time where you can ask a question in the hope of some kind of reliable answer, which is tell me every single precedent on this point. So I mean, I think it's obvious things are going to happen. Devastating things will happen with it.
Anyone else? Yes, Chui.
Hi, Toby. How do you advocate for a client whose case is hopeless? So if you're not even convinced that they have a good case, and then when you're before the judge, how do you convince the judge to rule in your client's favor?
I just want to say, in my dreams, I have clients with good cases. But in practice, one has this all the time. And actually, I think what happens is, as you get more senior, the arguments you have to put forward become more difficult. And that's why people are coming to you, in a sense. So there's certain guide rails in answering this. Obviously, there's a threshold beyond which you cannot run a case. And that's a question of professional conduct. You can't say anything that's dishonest. It's got to be honest. Beyond that, you have still, even if you've got a terrible case, you have got to persuade the court or the tribunal. You will never persuade the tribunal if you are simply going to damage your own credibility. You've got to be trusted. So that sets you another guide rail. You can't run an argument just because you thought of it and it's possible, and it won't breach your code of conduct if it's going to undermine you as an advocate. And people can say, well, that's ridiculous. Because if you've got another point which isn't quite so ridiculous, you won't be able to distinguish between them. So that guide rail tells you that you narrow down to what is as far away as possible from the threshold of ridiculous. It's got to be something that's credible, And you try and increase your credibility by perhaps presenting the less credible arguments and conceding them or giving them up or making clear you're not going anywhere near silly arguments. So it's an exercise in selection, judgment. It is judgment. You'd be surprised how many people don't exercise that judgment, partly because of large law firm mentality, nobody wanting to really give up things just in case, nobody having the courage. And that judgment is so important in the end. And even if it means turning the case into a different direction and just running a point. I had it very recently in a case which I argued just a few weeks back. It was a challenge in the English court to an investor state award and on jurisdiction. When you challenge jurisdiction of an arbitration tribunal, it's a de novo hearing before the court, so you can re-argue everything. The arguments that had been run in the arbitration, which I wasn't instructed to argue, involved some which were obviously wrong in my view. But there was groupthink and there were arguments that had been invested in and nobody wanted to change. But I insisted, just drop that argument. Right, it's risky. You reduce your chances because you're running 2 arguments, not 3. But that third argument is so obviously wrong, it's gonna hurt the others. So that's the process.
Yeah. It's what Lord Hoffman described, I think, as an eye for relevance. Yeah.
It takes courage.
Yeah, it does. Confidence and courage, absolutely. Anything else from anyone? Yes, Karen.
Hi, Toby. You mentioned about how the end users want results in a cost-efficient manner. And obviously time is cost, time is money. Do you have any personal tips or tricks in how to increase productivity or how to deliver work faster, quicker?
So I have lots of thoughts when I'm sitting as arbitrator. Yeah, because sitting as arbitrator, you see the world differently from counsel. Those are thoughts I don't agree with when I'm counsel. But as arbitrator, and similarly as judges, people have the same view. There's active case management that can very easily and readily streamline the process and make it cheaper and faster. And that's cutting out the redundancy. And that's forcing people to, for example, going back to the previous point, exercise judgment and selection earlier and not be on autopilot. One of the biggest problems in both arbitration and litigation, as I mentioned before, is autopilot. That means you start the case with a procedural timetable that has in it everything, so that you're going to have lots of pleadings and lots of memorials and document disclosure and witness statements and expert reports. And then you're going to have a long hearing to try and make sense of all that. And maybe have post-hearing briefs. And you've racked up the costs and you've racked up the time. And not every case needs it. So as arbitrator, I don't want counsel just to do what they want. I want to have a very tight procedural timetable that's put together with the benefit of a full understanding, as much as can be at the beginning, of what the case is about. And that means taking nothing for granted. So no autopilot, only bespoke procedure for what's needed for that case. And that's not difficult to do, actually.
Thank you, Toby. Okay, we're going to have to put an end to the Q&As because the champagne's on ice, but you can certainly ask Toby questions while you're having a glass of champagne. I am going to detain you for just another 3 minutes to speak a little bit about Endeavour Group Law Practice. And before I do that, can I first thank Toby for agreeing to do this. It's been an eye-opening session for me, I'm sure for everyone in the room. Thank you, Razlan. Thank you, Michelle. So Endeavour Group Law Practice is sponsoring this event. And what I'd like to speak to is just what we do and what we're trying to do. There are 2 things. Firstly, the Endeavour Group Law Practice. And the second thing I'd like to speak to as well is the Endeavour Advocacy Project. First to the GLP. As Toby has pointed out, you know, we have group practices in Malaysia, but we're limited by numbers. And in terms of the GLP, Pek Leng and I decided, I think a couple of years ago, to establish a set of chambers modeled on the traditional barristers' chambers that one finds in London, but operating within the limits that the Bar Council presents us here. I think, at least for me, it became clear too late in my career that there was a need for an independent for an independent bar, independent practitioners who only practiced as advocates and not as advocates and solicitors. And the reasoning for me was quite simple. I think it was an understanding that separating the tasks of advocate and solicitor permitted both to commit fully the most valuable resource we all possess for each task, and that is time. It was also, I think, driven by an understanding that our judicial system in Malaysia has, over time, become more and more sophisticated, both in scholarship and in forensics. And it was apparent to me and to Pek Leng and Alex, who's part of our chambers, that advocates needed to devote more time to addressing that, so we could be as helpful as possible to the decision maker. And being helpful to the decision maker, I think, Toby, I'm sure will agree, is what delivers the result. The client in Endeavour's case is never the lay client. It is always the instructing solicitor, and it is, and it will always remain the case that it is the instructing solicitor's client. So we see our role as helping those instructing solicitors achieve the result for the client in court. To that end, our time is devoted to advice, pleadings, and written and oral advocacy. The rest, which is, if you ask me, the hardest part, is taken up by the solicitors. It appears, at least to me, that for the foreseeable future, the Bar Council rules will still continue to limit the number of independent practitioners who can operate in a group to 5. And at the moment, I'm very, very lucky to be joined by Alex De Silva and Leong Pek Leng as members of our chambers. We have 2 spots to fill, and we are aiming to fill that with 2 senior advocates, hopefully not too distantly in the future. I should add that uniquely, if you do join Endeavour GLP as one of our barristers, all of us have to sign an undertaking that we will not take solicitors' work. So that is unique to the legal market in Malaysia. That means we can focus on advocacy. Now, because of the restrictions, this is where I come to the Endeavour Advocacy Project. I'll wrap this up in just a minute. And that is for the more junior practitioners. So the Endeavour Advocacy Project is aimed at practitioners from 0 to 15 years who have an ambition to become purely advocates. It is an association that I develop and I run, and it is a personal project. The members of that association, the Endeavour Advocacy Project, are not members of the GLP, but by being part of this project, part of this association, they have an opportunity to be mentored by senior advocates, enjoy the benefits of business development together with us, have access to the technological platforms that we have and the library, et cetera, and of course to be part of a collegiate community. In the project, we are open for the first couple of years to allowing juniors and senior juniors to continue doing solicitors' work, but that's something I hope we'll be able to persuade you fairly quickly that you do not need to do. Admission to that project is by application, and necessarily the numbers are limited in order for us to keep the standards high. I am able to tell you that as of January, we will have 5 members of the Endeavour Advocacy Project. They are all independent firms, and I can safely say that they are of a very, very high standard. So I'm very proud of that project, and if anyone wants to speak about it as well, please do come and have a chat with me when we break for lunch. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here, taking time out of your Saturday. I hope you've enjoyed the show so far. But now I think it's time to pop the champagne. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much to our guest Toby and our host Gopal as well as Razlan.